President Trump's tariffs, and tonight the U.S. and China sending conflicting messages over President Trump's tariffs, upending global markets and the U.S. economy. After President Trump insisted the two sides were actively discussing tariffs, China calling it fake news, a Chinese official saying there have been no talks. Rachel Scott is at the White House.
Get along very well.
Tonight,
China and the United States can together solve all of the problems of the world, if you think about it. So it's very important. And, you know, he was a friend of mine. I mean, he was here for a long time, right in that spot, except sitting in a very comfortable chair. He wasn't standing like you are. But we spent hours and hours talking. And, you know, he's an amazing guy.
Have you spoken to Venezuela?
The press hates when I say that, but he's an amazing person.
Have you spoken to anyone in Venezuela?
Victor Gao, who will blink first? Is it Donald Trump or President Xi?
I can tell you with all certainty that China will not be the first to blink. So the question is who will blink? And in the coming days and weeks, we will know who blinked. And as a matter of fact, that person or that country already blinked because it reversed itself on major issues.
The cost of $285 million, it could spell the loss of billions of dollars in revenue for American farmers.
here's why. Beijing has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on American agricultural products over the last decade.
Imagine waking up in Washington to find that billions of dollars have simply vanished from the U.S. economy overnight. Wall Street traders are panicking, farmers in Iowa are protesting, and think tanks in D.C. are holding emergency meetings. The cause? Not a war, not a natural disaster, not sanctions, but a bold move from Africa, a $285 million export hub built with China that has just turned America's century-old economic playbook on its head. For decades, Africa was treated as nothing more than a supplier of raw materials, cocoa beans shipped to Europe, cotton sent to Asia, minerals dug up and exported, at rock-bottom prices. Africa produced, the West profited. But now, something seismic is happening. This new export hub is not just a warehouse. It is a factory of sovereignty. It is a facility where Africa processes its own raw goods, stamps them with Made in Africa, and sends them to the world without begging for Western approval. This is why Washington is in a panic. Because for the first time, Africa is keeping the real profits at home. Instead of selling unprocessed cocoa for a few cents per kilogram, Africa is selling premium chocolate at global market prices. Instead of shipping crude oil for peanuts, Africa is refining and selling fuel to its neighbors, even to Europe when shortages hit. The result? Billions of dollars that used to flow into American corporations are now staying on the African continent, and the U.S. doesn't know what to do. They can't sanction an entire continent without destroying their own supply chains. They can't bully African leaders anymore because those leaders now have China, India, Russia, and the Gulf states ready to step in with funding, technology, and military support. This $285 million hub has triggered a chain reaction. Suddenly, African nations are asking, why not build more? Why not create hubs for coffee in Ethiopia, for tea in Kenya, for gold in Ghana, for cotton in Burkina Faso? Why keep exporting cheap when you can process, brand, and profit right here at home? And the fear in Washington isn't just about economics, it's about influence. Because once Africa controls the supply chain, it controls the conversation. No more lectures from IMF bureaucrats. No more aid packages tied to hidden conditions. No more foreign consultants telling Africa how to run its own economy. Make no mistake, this is a revolution. A revolution without guns, without coups, without wars. A revolution built on production, trade, and vision. And like every revolution, it is making the old powers nervous. America has always seen Africa as a market to exploit, but never as a competitor. Now Africa is becoming exactly that, a competitor with a new partner in China who is ready to finance, build, and defend this transformation. So buckle up, because what we are witnessing is not just an economic shift, it is the rebirth of a continent. And if Washington, Paris, and London thought they could stop it, they are already too late. Ladies and gentlemen, history is being rewritten before our very eyes, and this time it is not being written in Washington, London, or Brussels. It is being written right here on African soil. For decades, the narrative was simple. Africa produces raw materials, ships them off to foreign capitals, and buys them back at 10 times the price. We were told this was global trade. We were told this was development. We were told this was the price of joining the global economy. But something seismic just happened that the Western media barely reported on. Africa, together with China, just launched a $285 million state-of-the-art export hub, a logistics and processing network designed to change the rules of the global game. And make no mistake, this is not just a warehouse. This is not just a port, this is a symbol of Africa breaking free from centuries of extraction and exploitation, and it is already costing the United States billions of dollars in lost revenue, lost influence, and lost control. This export hub is more than infrastructure. It is a declaration of independence. For the first time in modern history, African goods will be processed, packaged, and branded right here in Africa before being shipped to Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and even the Americas. No longer will cocoa, coffee, lithium, manganese, and rare earth minerals leave Africa in raw form, only to return as overpriced chocolate bars, smartphones, or electric car batteries. No, this hub is Africa's new artery of wealth circulation, keeping profits where they belong, at home. And here is what terrifies Washington the most. This hub was not financed by the IMF. It was not dictated by the World Bank. It was not conditioned on structural adjustment programs that gutted African industries in the past. No, this was a deal negotiated on Africa's terms with China as an equal partner, not a colonial overlord. The U.S. State Department is panicking because they understand what this means. Every container that leaves this hub with a Made in Africa stamp is one less container arriving in America filled with raw resources they can control. Every finished product shipped to Asia is one less dollar flowing into the pockets of U.S. corporations that have profited from Africa's poverty for decades. And the numbers are staggering. Within just 6 months of operation, American companies have reported losses running into the billions. Their monopoly on cheap African exports is crumbling. Their hold on Africa's trade routes is breaking, and their ability to use trade as a political weapon is evaporating. But this is bigger than money. This is about power. For decades, trade deals were used as leverage to force African nations into political obedience. Vote this way at the UN or lose your aid package. Sign this military cooperation agreement or lose access to export quotas. That era is ending. This hub gives Africa bargaining power. It gives Africa options. And when Africa has options, America loses leverage. What is even more remarkable is how quickly other nations are joining this new wave. Nigeria has announced plans to replicate this model in Lagos. Kenya has allocated land near Mombasa for a second hub. Ethiopia is in talks with China to connect its railways directly to this new facility, creating a seamless trade corridor that bypasses Western shipping choke points. Washington can see what is coming, an Africa that is united, industrialized, and no longer begging for access to foreign markets but competing in them. The U.S. farm lobby is already crying foul because African processed cocoa butter is undercutting U.S.-made chocolate in Asian markets. Wall Street analysts are warning investors to brace for a long-term decline in American market share in sectors that once seemed untouchable. But instead of adapting, Washington is resorting to its old playbook: fear campaigns, disinformation, and diplomatic pressure. They are calling this hub a debt trap even though it is jointly owned by African states and financed on fair terms. They are warning of Chinese influence while conveniently forgetting that Western companies had a stranglehold on African economies for more than a century. And here is where the hypocrisy is so glaring it cannot be ignored. When the U.S. builds bases in Africa, they call it security. When they flood African markets with subsidized grain, they call it aid. But when Africa partners with China to build an export hub, they call it neocolonialism. This double standard is no longer acceptable. Africa has the right to trade with whoever it wants, on terms that benefit its people, not foreign shareholders. This hub represents that right. It represents sovereignty. It represents a future where Africa no longer exports poverty but prosperity. Already, job creation around the hub is booming. Thousands of young Africans are working in processing plants, logistics centers, and manufacturing facilities. Smallholder farmers are earning more because they can sell directly to processing companies instead of being squeezed by middlemen. Local economies are thriving. This is what development is supposed to look like: not endless debt, not perpetual dependency, but shared prosperity. And let us be very clear, this is only the beginning. The $285 million hub is the first phase of a multi-billion-dollar plan to connect African producers with global markets without going through the traditional Western choke points. The vision is bold: an Africa that exports value-added goods, not just raw resources. An Africa that sets its own prices. An Africa that determines its own destiny. When the first shipment of fully processed African coffee left the export hub bound for Asia, it was not just beans being transported, it was a symbol of a new era. The impact was felt instantly across the globe. American commodity traders panicked as futures prices dipped. Wall Street analysts scrambled to recalculate projections. And major U.S. corporations began lobbying Congress for urgent measures to counter what they called an existential threat to U.S. agricultural dominance. The White House summoned African diplomats behind closed doors, demanding explanations. But this time, Africa did not come to the table with a begging bowl. They came with confidence. They came with data showing the billions of dollars of value Africa had been losing every single year by exporting raw goods. They came with contracts signed with China, India, Brazil, and even Russia, nations eager to buy African goods. At fair prices, Washington was not used to this tone. For decades, African negotiators were forced to accept whatever was offered or face sanctions, trade restrictions, or IMF punishment. But now they had leverage, and leverage changes everything. The export hub's success began creating ripple effects far beyond its immediate location. Farmers in Mali, Niger, and Cameroon began pooling resources to transport their products there, cutting out foreign-controlled middlemen. Small entrepreneurs in Ghana began building packaging companies to supply goods for export. Logistics firms started hiring truck drivers, engineers, and IT specialists, creating thousands of jobs and generating new tax revenues for governments. This local economic boom posed a massive challenge to the U.S. model of engagement in Africa, a model based on dependency and extraction. In Washington, think tanks began publishing alarmist reports warning that China is capturing Africa's economic future. The U.S. media amplified the fear, portraying the hub as a Trojan horse for Beijing's geopolitical ambitions. But the reality on the ground told a different story. African nations were finally in the driver's seat. The next phase of the hub's plan sent shockwaves through global markets. Africa announced that it would begin producing finished cocoa products, chocolate bars, cocoa powder, and cocoa butter in quantities large enough to compete with European giants. This move directly threatened U.S. and European companies that have made billions by importing cheap raw cocoa and turning it into luxury goods. Suddenly, American and European chocolate companies were facing something they never imagined: competition from Africa itself. Supermarket shelves in Asia and the Middle East began stocking African-branded chocolate, proudly displaying 100 made in Africa. Consumers were curious, sales skyrocketed. Within months, African chocolate captured 20% of the Asian premium market. This was more than just business. It was psychological warfare. For decades, Western corporations built their brands on the backs of African farmers who earned pennies for their labor. Now those same farmers were seeing their names, their regions, and their cultures celebrated on international packaging. It was a cultural reawakening, a reclamation of dignity. Washington's reaction grew desperate. Lobbyists pushed for tariffs on African goods entering the U.S. market. Trade representatives threatened to review African Growth and Opportunity Act AGOA benefits, using access to U.S. markets as leverage. But Africa was no longer intimidated. They had options. Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America were lining up to buy what Africa was selling. The U.S. also attempted to play the debt trap narrative louder, accusing China of enslaving Africa through loans. But African finance ministers went public, revealing that the hub was financed through a joint ownership model, with profits reinvested into African infrastructure. This level of transparency stunned Western observers and destroyed Washington's favorite talking point. The hub also created a new kind of Pan-African pride. For the first time, multiple African nations were cooperating on trade as a bloc rather than as isolated countries competing for Western favor. Customs barriers were lowered. Cross-border infrastructure was upgraded. New digital platforms allowed farmers and manufacturers to coordinate supply and demand in real time. This unity terrified Washington more than anything else. A united Africa with an efficient trade hub is a nightmare for Western corporations that thrive on divide and rule tactics. Suddenly, Africa was negotiating as one, demanding fair prices, and walking away from exploitative contracts. As the hub expanded, it began processing not just agricultural goods but also minerals. Lithium from Zimbabwe, cobalt from the Dar Sea, and manganese from South Africa were now being partially refined before export. This meant that for every ton of raw material leaving Africa, a larger share of the value stayed in Africa. Western tech companies, who rely on these minerals for smartphones, batteries, and electric vehicles, started seeing their profit margins squeezed. This triggered panic on Wall Street. Tech CEOs made emergency trips to African capitals, offering new deals, higher prices, local partnerships, even equity stakes in Western companies just to keep supply flowing. But African leaders were no longer satisfied with crumbs. They demanded processing plants be built locally. They demanded technology transfer. They demanded job creation. And slowly but surely, Western companies began to comply because they had no choice. The economic results were staggering. African GDP growth surged, poverty rates began to decline. Tax revenues increased, funding schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Young people who once dreamed of migrating to Europe now saw opportunities at home. But perhaps the most shocking development was Africa's new geopolitical confidence. At the UN, African nations began voting as a bloc on key resolutions, refusing to be pressured into siding with Western powers. In international trade forums, they challenged unfair subsidies that allowed Western farmers to undercut African producers. They called for a new global financial architecture that treated Africa as an equal stakeholder. Washington, frustrated and humiliated, began losing its grip on the continent. Their usual tactics, sanctions, aid cuts, media smear campaigns were no longer working. Every time they tried to punish one African country, others stepped in to support it through the hub's trade network, and the world was watching. Latin American nations began studying the African model, considering similar partnerships with China. Southeast Asian countries began asking African leaders for advice on negotiating with Western powers. The export hub had become not just an economic project but a political symbol, proof that the global South could rise together. The final blow to U.S. dominance came when African leaders announced that they would begin pricing certain exports, including cocoa, coffee, and some minerals, in local currencies and the Chinese yuan instead of the U.S. dollar. This was a direct challenge to the dollar's global supremacy, and Wall Street went into meltdown. American media called it an economic rebellion. Washington threatened to reassess relations with African nations, but the move was irreversible. The hub became a currency diversification center, allowing African traders to settle deals without going through New York or London. This saved billions in transaction fees and reduced Africa's exposure to U.S. financial sanctions. By the time the hub marked its first anniversary, it had processed goods worth over $15 billion, created tens of thousands of jobs, and shifted billions of dollars away from Western corporations into African hands. For Washington, this was nothing short of a geopolitical earthquake. And yet, for Africa, this was only the beginning. Plans were announced for Phase 2, expanding capacity, adding more countries to the network, and building an African-owned shipping fleet to control logistics end-to-end. No more relying on foreign shipping cartels that charge exorbitant rates. No more dependency on Western insurance companies that dictate terms. This was Africa, bold and unapologetic, taking control of its destiny. The conclusion was clear. The $285 million Africa-China export hub was not just costing the U.S. billions, it was dismantling a centuries-old system of economic exploitation. And as one African leader boldly declared at the inauguration of Phase 2, "We are not here to ask permission. We are not here to apologize. We are here to trade, to prosper, and to write a new chapter in history where Africa is no longer a supplier of cheap labor and raw materials, but a manufacturer, an innovator, and a global powerhouse." The hall erupted in applause. Outside, thousands of young Africans waved flags, chanting in unison, "Africa rising! Africa rising!" Washington heard them loud and clear, and for the first time in a very long time, the United States realized that its grip on Africa had finally been broken. This is no longer just an economic story. This is a declaration of independence. What began as a $285 million export hub has turned into a full-blown reordering of global power. America thought Africa would forever remain the supplier of cheap raw materials, forever dependent, forever begging for aid. But today, Africa has proven that it is capable of turning trade into a weapon of liberation. Think about the numbers for a moment. Billions of dollars in U.S. profits have evaporated in less than a year, not because of war, not because of sanctions, but because Africans made a simple decision: to process their own goods on their own soil for their own benefit. Washington cannot bomb its way out of this. It cannot sanction its way out of this. The only thing the U.S. can do now is watch as Africa builds a future that no longer revolves around American approval. And this is only the beginning. The export hub is not just a building, it is a symbol, a catalyst, a fire that is spreading across the continent. Ghana is planning similar facilities for cocoa and shea butter. Kenya is setting up its own for tea and horticulture. Nigeria is negotiating with China for a massive oil and gas processing plant. This is a chain reaction, a domino effect that no superpower can stop. For years, the U.S. dictated terms. They said Africa could not compete. They said Africa must accept foreign investors as the solution. They said that breaking free would lead to economic collapse. And yet, here we are, stronger, richer, and freer than ever before. What terrifies Washington most is not the loss of billions. It is the loss of control. For decades, they shaped Africa's narrative. They decided what was good policy, what was sound economics, what was sustainable development. Now Africa is writing its own policy, its own economics, its own development agenda, and it does not require Washington's approval. Look around the world. Everywhere you see resistance to exploitation, you see inspiration coming from Africa. Leaders in Asia are watching. Latin America is taking notes. Even Europe as working class is beginning to question why their governments fight so hard to maintain old colonial privileges abroad while ignoring poverty at home. This is bigger than coffee, cocoa, or minerals. This is about power. The power to decide who benefits from African labor, the power to decide how wealth is distributed. The power to say no to those who once treated Africa as nothing more than a resource pit. The U.S. can threaten, it can complain, it can lobby, but the tide has turned. The billions they are losing are not coming back because Africa has discovered something far more valuable than money: the will to unite, the will to own, the will to rise. So let Washington panic, let Wall Street tremble, let the old order scream about geopolitical threats. Africa is not a threat. Africa is a reality, a rising giant that will no longer be ignored. And as this export hub grows, as more Africans build factories, as more goods leave African ports stamped with Made in Africa, one truth becomes undeniable. Africa is no longer the background of the world's story. Africa is the headline, the message to America, to Europe, to any nation that believed Africa would stay forever silent. Is this: the era of exploitation is over. The age of African power has begun.